Gratitude to John Cabot University and to our curators, Helton Levi and Eleonora Diamanti, for bringing us together and unpack these aesthetic and political layers of digital vigilantism. So my paper proposes an anthropological and ethnographic outlook on urban safety, displacing perhaps our attention away from traditional state-centered policies and to go on to the intimate, domestic, and intersubjective arena. In the urban peripheries of Buenos Aires, particularly within the municipality of Morón, I will show a few pictures around this geographic scenery later on. The middle-class family and the middle-class family homes has ceased to be a mere sanctuary based on perhaps caring relation and self-care practices. Instead, it has mutated into a fortified landscape where object, emotions, and everyday control are permanently intertwined. So I want to share with you that even though this wasn't and it's not my thesis or my current research project, it certainly appears during my research, and my presentation is based on two previous works, one related to a book chapter from Latin American book around security mechanisms and urban environment, in which I examine how privacy is safeguarded through artifacts, technologies, and the performative of care, and other related to object in public space, focus on pots, on cacerolas, the use of pots in public protest in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Latin America. So these thoughts I bring today are based on those ideas and with other analysis due to my new interest. So to outline a little bit what I'm going to talk about, I will introduce you to my methods and my geographical scope. I will talk about the objects that appear in this domestic life, emotions, and how everyday practices are reshaped. And perhaps I will share a few thoughts that we can discuss later. So let me first, before grasping these methods, to share with you a few vignettes of how home relations are being reshaped nowadays. So as soon as she enters her home, Gloria makes two movements. First, she scans the ground floor to check that there is nothing unusual. Second, she enters a numerical code to deactivate her alarm. Second vignette. Before going to bed, Luisa, just in case, activates a siren organized together with her neighbors to signal that the house is not empty. Third vignette. Meanwhile, after finishing his working day, Oscar leaves his car at his mother-in-law's house rather than bringing it into his own property at night because it's dangerous and so as not to clutter his living room garage. Finally, Isabella decides to install a protective perimeter net on her flat's balcony and begins searching online for an alarm system because she no longer feels at ease where she lives. These individuals alter their schedules and pattern of consumption, develop new forms of vigilance and additional tasks, and establish relationships of dependence on devices and technology. As a result, they burden their daily routines with countless small acts of management intended to help to feel safe, even though such actions do not necessarily produce security. Practices concerning how and under what conditions one should secure oneself form a recurring log in the everyday scenes and routines of the families with whom I conducted fieldwork. So I wanted to depict a little bit of the surveillance landscape at home. So this study is based on a long-term fieldwork trajectory, because I started my fieldwork with families in 2015 for my PhD, where I work around access to housing and how people sustain their and maintain their houses. And I map how families build their homes and how they establish home aspiration amid a state retreatment, where we were in the Macri era. Mauricio Macri was our president, and it was a public discourse of economic austerity. So middle-class families started to enter in a decay scenario. I continue, or I have another insight during the pandemic, because my research around the house really bump up in that context, and I start to track how people live during COVID, and they start to send me videos, and so I did this digital ethnography through that time, and I restart and amplify my work with families in 2024 in order to see what was happening during. Now we are in the Milei era. We can talk about politics and how this relates to domesticity later, but we have a big period of high inflation for a long time, also during the end of the COVID. And so I would like to, I am still in that project, trying to understand how household over-indebtedness relate to how people are relating to their immediate environment, and how perhaps this structural decay make more easier to see defensive adaptations in the domestic scenario. So I work with 5 families at the beginning, and now I'm working with 20 families. And my fieldwork is in the outskirts of Buenos Aires, in the conurbano bonaerense. It's like in greater Buenos Aires, and normally it's a territory depicted as dangerous, and people, for example, tourists are said not to go there because they are going to be robbed. And so this imaginary of how dangerous the conurbano bonaerense is really also shapes how people relate to security at their homes. So one dimension I highlight in my presentation title is the objects. So I want to highlight how there is a domestic shift in the material and architectural transformation of dwelling, guided by this idea I mentioned in other presentations before, this fortress logic that I was able to see in my fieldwork, where I've recorded how domestic spaces are progressively reshaped through the incorporation of heavy materials like thick iron bars, razor wire, automated gates, and new types of electrified fences also. So these heavy physical barriers do more than just like obstruct potential squatters. They reconfigure the aesthetic of distance, I say, because there is this permanent visual statement cast into the public arena. So they are trying to assert that the exterior and explain that as the exterior is hostile, the interior must be heavily armored. So I think that this is not only a material barrier, is also organized and based on a social technical infrastructure like matrix that has perhaps 3 couple dimensions. So I mentioned these heavy materials for the protections Also, second is like these electronic surveillance devices. We talk a lot about in these 2 days, like about IP cameras, volumetric sensors, and how these, I'm seeing how these are part of the landscape of the home. Are new monitors over the desk of the rooms, are monitors that are in the kitchens where you can cook and observe who is around the house at the same time, for instance. So to these electronic surveillance devices adds the third point, that are the digital platforms that are linking to this domestic space. And I think that these elements constitute like an infrastructure network that demands constant financial investment, but also like this cognitive attention, and also demands for residents like to be in a proactive vigilance state. I also observed like how this presence of alarm keypads in the kitchen wall, blinking LEDs of camera that shine through the windows, and you can see that in the patios, and monitoring screen that are living and modifying radically these spaces. So I think that the home, from what I could see during the years, is like a monitoring zone in some cases, where it's interesting, something I just said, like the most mundane activities like cooking, dining, watching, streaming are structured also by an ongoing requirement for control. And this is something like really make me pay attention on how this is reshaping. Okay, this is reshaping this landscape. Other word I use in the title is emotions. So I would like to share with you a few things that are intertwined to this landscape. So, for example, Gloria and Luisa, 2 of my interlocutors, were feeling overwhelmed and disturbed, while other 2, Rosa and Isabella, expressed a growing sense of unease and discomfort in their everyday lives, because they start to feel that they will have like an immediate risk. And these permeate this domestic life and routines. So these feelings of anxiety, relentless and constant vigilance became woven into this experience, and they reshape also how they move in their homes and through the city and through the near space, geographic space. And something I highlight in my abstract, it was this idea and phrase and narrative of the just in case, I quote. So how this just in case, it captures an anticipatory logic, like a preventive disposition that translates the unfamiliar, the possible danger, is translate and normalize, and how the people just in case tries to make these efforts and investments in fences, ups, and alarms. So it's interesting how security becomes both a moral imperative and also a consumer practice. And third, like everyday practices, as it's not like separate from these, but I would like to highlight a few practices that are related to the use of WhatsApp groups and how people relate to neighbor that is not face-to-face, these are not face-to-face relations, but these are WhatsApp groups that are mainly organized around securitization practices that they develop. For example, to make a siren sound if someone on something suspicious goes around there. So They also share through their WhatsApp group edited screenshot, CCTV footage, what they call suspicious, of what they call suspicious. They make memes, and this is really interesting because they also, when they hear a sound, they started to know when the sound is real, when it's not, because they have themselves the control to make the siren sound as they develop these security systems. So I like to close for now, then I can go further in the questions, but to mention and to think with you these final thoughts that examining the domestic politics of what I call domestic politics of surveillance reveals, I think that the home is by no means an isolated domain, as we all know, but it also it's marked by these market pressures or political shift, and is precise an arena where urban mistrust, fear, and inequality are daily reproduced, contested also in the corner of the family life and the communal activity. And I think that this also brings us to a first core of conclusions or ideas about cultural legitimacy. So urban vigilante action does not gain its authority solely through top-down political discourse, as we saw in other presentations too. Instead, its legitimacy is manufactured, I would say, through everyday aesthetic experiences, editing practices, and these sensory registers that transform this lateral surveillance into an act of perhaps maternal or parental care and a moral duty for oneself, and also these families and near community protection. So what I would like to highlight is, like, I'm seeing a curve, a telling curve of surveillance proliferation, that it demands a perpetual alertness from families and is generating a deeper emotional dependence on technology of control, where checking for threats becomes a gamified habit embedded into a daily screen time. So thank you very much.